I have a confession to make. I play video games. Yeah, I play video games all the time. I play them on a console. I play them on the computer. I play games every day. And that's a big confession for me because I'm a university professor. We're not supposed to play video games. And I think people who play video games tend to be apologetic about it or kind of defensive because we tend to think of video games as a waste of time. Similarly, stories are often thought of as just entertainment. And I'm here today to tell you that when we think of video games as a waste of time, and when we think of stories as just entertainment, we're squandering massive opportunities that game stories offer to create real positive social change. So let's just take a look at how common games are. 58% of Canadians play some kind of video game. 46% of that number are female. 54% are male. The average age of gamers is 31, and 37% of Canadians over the age of 55 are gamers. Do those numbers surprise you? Yeah. Do you know what surprises me, though, is that even though games are so much a part of, well, becoming part of everyday life, we don't take them very seriously. We don't take seriously that they can change our mind. And I don't mean metaphorically. I mean that games actually change cognition. So research has shown that even the most heinous, biggest waste of time game you can think of actually changes cognition. And based on that research, Dr. Adam Ghazali and his team created a video game that helps Alzheimer's patients to regain cognitive control. They can think more clearly, they're more focused. I mean, that's amazing. But Dr. Ghazali has a warning for us. He says, game mechanics, game processes are incredibly powerful, and we need to be really mindful of the type of games we develop. But are we? And I don't think we are, because as a society, we tend to think of games as a waste of time. So let's turn our attention to stories. Stories are really all we do. From the time we get up in the morning until we go to bed at night, we tell stories. How was your day? And we share information and this kind of thing. And stories also have rules. And those rules, it might surprise you to learn, guide us in everyday situations. So I'm going to explain by way of analogy. I'm sure a number of you stopped and got a Timmy's this morning. And Timmy's and Starbucks actually tell very different stories about one product. It's just coffee, right? But Timmy's, I think somebody just said, just coffee. Wow. What? It's patriotic to go to Timmy's, right? And Timmy's tells the story of you go to Timmy's, it's just folks kind of people, and you get an ordinary coffee, and you speak a certain language to situate yourself in that story. So you'll order a large or a medium, you order a double-double or a regular, and I call it diner speak. And Starbucks, conversely, tells a much different story. It's sold to an urban, professional, sophisticated kind of person who has feels a kind of debt to the planet, that through their coffee they're going to make the world a better place because that coffee is fair trade and this kind of thing. And you speak a certain kind of language to situate yourself in that kind of global story. You actually have to speak Italian a little bit, to order your coffee. So one day I'm going to out myself. I'm a Starbucks person. And I go to Timmy's, though. I had a Timmy's this morning, so I'm patriotic as well. But I'm standing in line, long line in Starbucks, and this guy's at the head of the line. He's ordering, and he orders a large double-double at Starbucks, and everybody in the line goes, and there's some titters, and he turns bright red, right? And what that tells you right away is that you can't tell the Timmy's story in the Starbucks, and you can't tell the Starbucks story in the Timmy's. And so stories have rules that guide us through everyday situations. But do stories actually change cognition? Well, come on, you know I'm going to say, yep, they do. So reading changes the brain connectivity, increases cognition, focus, and so on. And a lot of the reports on this research tend to focus on that reading is better than watching TV and so forth, but to me, that's not what the most interesting thing is. The most interesting part of this research is that you take on the perspective of a character, and it's that perspective that you take on that changes your cognition. And in many video games, you do exactly the same thing. You take on the perspective of a character that you're performing as. Okay, so where are we? Well, I know we're at TEDx, but in my talk, we know that, one, video games change cognition. We know, two, stories have rules that guide us through certain social situations. And we also know that stories also change cognition. And so I've come up with this formula, trying to be scientific here. And it basically means game stories are really powerful. And there's a positive way to use game stories. So I want to introduce you to a project by MIT called the Gambit Lab. And they produce games for emotional health. And this is one of the games. It's called Elude. And you play as a depressed persona. And this game is actually undergoing clinical trials at DePaul University. And it's going to be part of patient care packages, so it works. And the game story is actually directed towards a specific group that supports their emotional health. But what about games that include stories that are oppressive? There are stories that were developed that were designed to oppress. And game developers don't know that, I don't think so, because mainly in our society, we think of stories as entertainment. And so game developers choose games that are going to sell a lot of games, right? And so one of those stories that are often included or turned into video games is the modern Western. So this is Red Dead Redemption. It's an incredibly popular game. It's still popular. And unfortunately, because it incorporates the modern Western, which has a very specific history, it is a tool for oppression. So I'd like you to travel back in time with me as we discover the origins of the modern Western. And so you can know just how it became a tool for oppression. It was actually developed, the modern Western, by a group of patrician men. And that's just two of the members. Teddy Roosevelt, who was president of the United States in the early 20th century, and his aristocratic friend, Owen Wister. And they were part of a larger group of men who believed in frontier ideals. And they would practice those, so those ideals include, ruggedness, hardiness, extreme individualism, tying up your bootlaces and marching along, being your own man. And they felt that following those frontier ideals would make for the best man. And they would practice those ideals by actually traveling west and hunting and fishing. So they kind of played at hardship and struggle. And that was fine for them, because at the end of the day, they could go back to their mansions and they never had to worry about their next meal. But in the early 20th century, it was also a time of great economic disparity. The reservation system was being implemented. Women were fighting for the vote. Laborers were fighting for safe workplaces. And these guys just didn't understand this, because they followed an ideal of some people were just born more equal than others, and they were just born more equal than you, and you should know your place, right? And some of the beliefs these guys held were racial segregation, that's fine. Some of them believed that women shouldn't have the vote. A number of them believed that indigenous peoples are a dying race and were ineffectual. And there was a lot of protests going on. And what happened is that all of those ideals were then taken by Wister and were translated into the modern Western. And in this way, these guys could shore up power and spread these ideals far and wide. And so some of the ideals that got translated into the Western, or how they appear in the modern Western, are the cowboy hero works hard to establish a better life. He's a natural gentleman. He goes on a series of adventures in which he furthers his fortunes and quells social problems, so racial tensions, labor unrest, and so on, through his natural talent in using language or violence or some combination of the two. His white masculinity and individualism are celebrated, imperialist expansion is a given, and he eventually marries a woman who learns her place. And all of these ideals have been obsessively, or these rules of this story, remember stories have rules, and all of these rules have been reiterated in print and film and now in video games. And so I'm just going to show you just a part of, or talk about a part of Red Dead Redemption, to show you how these rules play out. So this is John Marston, and in general, you're supposed to save your family. This is the character, this is the perspective you take on. You're supposed to save your family so you're supposed by hunting down your former gang members. And one of the gang members he hunts down is Dutch Vanderlyn, who has gathered around him, or with him, bad Indians. Now, I use the word Indian very carefully here because it's a word that's synonymous with misrepresentation. And that's exactly what's going on here. And the game processes support or are guided by the rules of the story. And one of the rules of the story that Wister wrote is that indigenous peoples have to be represented as a dying race, they have to be removed from the land, and they have to be shown to be ineffectual. And in this game, in this section of the game, you shoot Indians en masse. And if you shoot a law enforcement officer, you cannot finish the mission, you fail the mission. So the rules of the story are followed. So why wouldn't they just use henchmen, different races, just have Dutch Vanderlyn have a bunch of henchmen that are around him? Because the Western, with this modern Western, the rules are Indians have to be part of the story and they have to be represented this way. I have some good news though. Stories can be changed. And in the early 20th century, if I can take you back there with me, Mourning Dove wrote a Western that countered the ideals of the modern Western that Wister and his pals created. She knew that this representation of indigeneity was not only incorrect, it was practically criminal. And she believed so strongly in producing this book. It took her over 10 years, by the way, well over 10 years to publish it. And do you know how she wrote it? Check this out. She wrote it after working all day in the fields as a migrant worker in a tent with an old typewriter and a gas lamp, pumping out these pages, because she knew that stories affect actual change in the world. She rewrote that story. And how did she rewrite it? Well, in a lot of different ways, but one of the ways I wanted to share with you is that the hero of the story is an Aboriginal woman. And she is kick-ass. She rides better than anyone on the range. And the cowboys, they respect her. They don't lust after her, they respect her. She's a leader, and they know it. Imagine if she, Kajilia, the hero, this Aboriginal woman, was the hero in Red Dead Redemption. All right? What a different story, what a different perspective that would be. And I think that that is tremendously exciting. It is so important to harness the power of game stories. And I'm excited to tell you that there are lots of different small labs popping up, game developers who are trying to do exactly this. So I want to introduce you to Game Changer at the University of Chicago, where inner city kids are invited in to learn how to develop their own games. So instead of having, for example, Grand Theft Auto, mapping out these kids' lives, they take control of the game mechanics and processes. They harness their own stories, and they produce stories that enable and change their communities. This is really exciting work. And I think that it is absolutely crucial that we are aware. I'm not saying that we should stop playing video games. My God, no. Just like at the beginning of the talk, I couldn't handle that. But what we need to do is to become aware of the power of story to change cognition, the power of game processes, and use them wisely. Because when we can harness that power, then we'll be able to affect real, actual social change and better our communities. Thank you very much.